I said at the outset, in case you joined late, a very warm welcome to all of you who are in attendance. It is a bit different for us this year. We're doing something a little different because it's a virtual, but it's been a real pleasure getting this together, and we hope that you do enjoy it. So, first and foremost, what are we going to look at? We have a wealth of collections in the library, and in the space of time that we have, it is absolutely, well, next to impossible, if not impossible, to narrow down to a manageable selection for you. We've tried to show you a few snapshots of the more remarkable items, but really it is just a drop in the ocean. So anyway, in the brief time we have for the talk, we look at material dating from thousands of years before Christ, right up to the present day. The dog will have some critical appraisals of my speech, but we'll just learn to live with that. With the caveat that my pronunciation of Latin is not as good as it might be, we'll move on to the next slide, please. Now, David mentioned these. These are cuneiform tablets. Cuneiform tablets date from 3500 BC up to 1900 BC. And they're absolutely fascinating. They're hands down the oldest thing in our collection. A lot of them have royal inscriptions. They were the sort of thing offering testimony to the king. That's quite exciting. A lot of the others are just act as administrative and economic accounts, and that's, well, not quite as exciting. One of the ironies is that they themselves are amazing, but what they depict is often quite prosaic and workaday. Notes for trading and so on. And you can imagine, I suppose, that for scholars of that era, that's actually far more interesting than a royal inscription because it tells something about the social life of the time. Now, the one you can see is, it's a gable-shaped stone seal from the pre-writing period. And we think it originates from Anatolia, which is modern-day Turkey, or possibly northern Syria. And it depicts, you can't really see it there maybe, but there's 3 antelopes. And what it was a security seal, which would be passed in trading. The next slide, please, Louise. So we'll jump forward a few millennia, in fact. We'll go to the medieval period. Now, those of you that know anything about Maynooth know about St. Patrick's College, which David mentioned, which the Russell is based in. And I suppose it'll come as no surprise that there's a strong theme of religion and theology in our collections. So before the advent of print, we tend to talk about manuscripts, and that can mean anything from 1 page to a bound volume, in effectively looking like a book. At the time, the medieval era, most manuscripts came from religious centers, so monasteries, abbeys, and so forth. They were a huge investment of time. You're probably familiar with the Book of Kells and other similar things. They're painstakingly transcribed. They have absolutely beautiful illuminated inscriptions and illustrations, and they tend almost exclusively to be focused on religious matters. Now, this is a trend that continues, but as of the 15th century, around about 1400, mid-1400s, you start to see lay people taking interest in this kind of thing. And what we have on the screen here is an image from a book of hours. And your typical book of hours, it would have a calendar for the year with religious feast days and festivals. There'd be a focus on saints, both the more broadly known, the universally venerated saints, and the more locally venerated saints. They'd have set prayers for different points of the day and readings for different points of the day. Now, you look at the image, you can see that they have absolutely the beautiful illustrations, decorated borders, which you can see on the far right, and the capital letter, one of which you can see just at the bottom. It will come as no surprise to you, before the mass production of print was possible, that such a thing was very, very expensive. So your average book of hours, if there is such a thing as an average book of hours, could only be afforded by the very wealthy. And it became, for wealthy merchants and lay people, it became very much a status symbol. Having one showed that you had money. Next slide, please, Louise. So now this is really interesting. Maynooth has a large corpus of Gaelic manuscripts with 4 main collections. I've noted them there. The really interesting thing about this, we could talk at length about the manuscripts, but it's a really important reminder to a difficult challenge for us. Manuscripts and collections are not always held together. Okay, so on the slide here, both of these manuscripts are from the Ocurri Collection, which you can see is the third bullet point down. The one on the left is held by Maynooth. The one on the right is actually held in Trinity College, Dublin. It can happen for various reasons. It can be that the collection was split up between a family, so one son inherited a certain amount, another son inherited another, and they in due course passed it down or elected to do something different with it. The other general reason is that they might have been kept separate to keep them safe. So they might have represented something to a family or a group of people, and by separating it, you guaranteed, or at least if you separate among two people, you double the chance that it would be there in perpetuity. Now, we have an archive, which I'll mention briefly later, relating to the Marquess of Sligo, and we have part of that archive. Trinity, I think, have part of it. The National Library has part of it. Westport House in Mayo has part of it. And Quinnipiac University in Connecticut has part of it. So that's quite a fragmented situation to deal with. In the case of the Ocurri ones, the original manuscripts were owned by the topographer John O'Donovan. And John O'Donovan gave part of his manuscript to Eugene Ocurri, who was a fellow scholar, and it was a relation through marriage. O'Donovan gave it to Ocurri on the basis of a loan, but O'Donovan died before he got it back. So O'Donovan bequeathed his manuscript collection to Trinity College. Ocurri didn't quite honour those wishes, and he held on to his particular part. It went to the Catholic University, and when the Catholic University closed, it came to Maynooth. Now, a manuscript that's in Trinity partly and partly Maynooth is not too much of a challenge. It's 20 kilometers distant between the two repositories. But when you think of greater fragmentation, you can see it's a real challenge for researchers where they might have to go to various different locations to try and get a sense of a corpus of manuscripts. One of the great things about digitization is that we can start to repatriate these in a way. We can start to bring them all together into one corpus of collection, even if it's only virtually. Can we have the next slide, please, Louise? Now, incunabula, or incunables. I don't know if people are familiar with this. An incunable, it's an early printed book. It's from the very earliest days of print in Europe. It means that the word translates as of the cradle, and it refers to books printed before 1500 AD. So this is kind of an arbitrary figure. If you see one from 1499 and you see one from 1502, they're not going to be that different. Most of them, because of the way the print evolved in Europe, most of them come from Germany, but we have 59 in total, and we have some from other regions. The Low Countries, France, and other places. The manuscripts are handwritten, incunables are print, but you can see here that they are actually works of art themselves. They still have decoration, if not as much as a manuscript might have. And interestingly as well, even though they are print, they actually look very similar to the manuscripts that came before them. And that was intentional. It was all part of the evolution. Next slide, please, Louise. So, let's have a look at this item. This is the Calendarium Romanum. It's from 1518. This is really interesting because it points to the presence of Ireland in the European consciousness. Now, Stoeffler was a professor of mathematics in Tübingen, and he made a proposal for an amendment to the Julian calendar. He made it in the early 16th century. It wasn't actually accepted formally until about the 1580s. But as part of it, he listed all the major cities from different European kingdoms, starting with Western Europe. So you can see at the top left where it says Hibernian, and that's Ireland. It's a reference to Ireland. There's a reference there to the Roman Ptolemy, and Ptolemy is famous for designing the first known map of Ireland. It's not very geographically accurate, but it's quite remarkable all the same. There's also references, it's probably quite hard to see there, but there's Reba, Lamerica, and Ganaforidia. And it's not entirely certain what they represent, but we think they represent Loch Rib, Limerick, and Stonyford. Stonyford, I think, is in Kilkenny. They all had Roman connections of some sort. Okay, next slide, please. So again, just keeping with the theme of the Irish in Europe, 100 years after, Thomas Messingham from Meath was living in Paris, and he published this. You can see here, it's the Florilegium. He published in 1624. And what it does is it details the lives and acts of the Irish saints. So you can see there St. Columba, St. Patrick, St. Bridget, Bridget being the patron saint of Kildare, where we are, of course. So again, a strong Irish presence throughout the sort of the late medieval and early modern period in Europe. Next slide, please, Louise. So I won't spend too long on these items. One is from the 17th century, one is from the 19th century. Just want to note a couple of things. Firstly, the item on the left there, it's quite hard to see, but it's a really interesting example of pre-Gaelic revival translation of Greek. So you have the Gaelic revival in the 1870s and beyond, where these things start to pick up momentum. But this is from before that. This is from 1844. And it's a translation of Homer. The one on the right is the Notitia Dignitatum. That's an administrative list for the Roman Empire, the late 4th and 5th centuries AD. Now, we have actually got 3 copies of this. We have 1623, 1665, and 1729. It's published quite extensively. Obviously, we have a few copies. But as a source, it's remarkable because there's nothing else like it from that period. So it's incredibly important for classic scholars in terms of understanding Roman bureaucracy. The other thing I should note, most importantly, is our classics collection is world class. It's absolutely outstanding. How we treat these items has thankfully evolved over time. So you can see on the top right, you can see some handwriting, Ant 1. And on the item in the Homer translation, you can see a stamp. We thankfully don't do this sort of thing anymore. It was from what we might call less enlightened times when it was deemed okay to do that. If we did this sort of thing, our conservators who you'll meet after me would have very strong words with us. So things have evolved. Next slide, please, Louise. Now, Mr. Shakespeare. This is absolutely brilliant. This is in our St. Canice's collection over in the main library, in our special collections. It's from 1685. It's Shakespeare's 4th folio. Now, the first one is one of the most sought after books in the world. The 4th isn't far behind it. The first folio brought together 36 plays. And for those of you like me that suffered through Shakespeare for your leaving cert, 18 of them in the first folio would not have been recorded as his if it hadn't been published. And every successive folio then, greater plays were recorded as attributable to Shakespeare. So if you didn't have the folios, for example, no one would be studying Macbeth as a Shakespeare play. This one, as I said, is 1685. It's in near perfect condition. Interestingly, it's the first one that has that very famous image of Shakespeare you can see on the left. They call it the dome-headed portrait, which always seems a bit harsh. It's by Martin Drushout. It's absolutely brilliant work. Next slide, please. So again, keeping with sort of the same era, not precisely, this is our 1688 copy of Milton's Paradise Lost. Now, Paradise Lost is interesting because it's incredibly successful as a publication. It's been in publication since Milton wrote it in 1667. One of the cool things for book scholars and scholars of art is that when something has that length of consistent publication, you can really chart the change and evolution in artistic styles. So you can see here, the image on the left is Lucifer, it's the creation of man, by John Baptist Medina. But again, your image of Lucifer, and indeed your images of the angels, even the length of the wings, Lucifer's physiognomy, is all very different to how it would be 150 years later or more modernly. So popular books let us study them more, not just the content, but the evolution of the publishing trade. Next slide, please. Now, again, coming back, we mentioned that Maynooth has a large amount of works relating to religion and theology. I want to just talk briefly about this one. It's from the wonderfully challenging titled Missale Romanum ex Decretio Sacrosancti Concilii Tridenti Restitutum, I hope. It's printed in Lyon by Bernicet in 1782. Now, it's very nice. It has a wonderful front piece of Christ on the cross. It has musical notation through it. It's a great book in and of itself. But we've kept in the image these lovely, delicate silk ties. They're original, and they have these lovely tassels at the end. Now, this can be a lovely challenge for our conservation colleagues, but it does remind us that a book isn't always just print and images and a binding. There's often other things in it, especially around that time. And it's actually great in a work that is this old to still have those ties. I should note as well, and David mentioned it, that Maynooth, we have this remarkable Hibernian Bible Society collection. It's about 2,600 different Bibles spanning 600 languages. Some of the languages are no longer used, spoken anymore, and it's just absolutely sensational. We'll move on to the next slide, please, Louise. So we'll talk a bit about archives. Now, David mentioned some of the ones that are held by St. Patrick's. Maynooth University, we try to treat all the collections as a whole. And over in the main library and special collections, we have a wonderful array of archival collections. Now, an archive can be any size or in any topic. It'll often be the collection of an individual or of an institution. Ours go across different themes. They go from small boxes, a couple of items, to boxes of hundreds of items and hundreds of boxes. So let's look at a few. Next slide, please, Louise. So we'll start with the literary. In terms of scale, probably literary archives are the ones that we have the most of. We have this one here. This is the playwright Teresa Deavy. Now, Deavy hailed from Waterford. She's principally known for her work with the Abbey Theatre in the 1930s, but she also had success with BBC Radio. Our collection consists of a variety of documents relating to her work and her legacy. It includes correspondence from people like the author Frank O'Connor. You can see that, I hope, on the left. We have theatre programmes, and we have different versions of her scripts. So you can see the middle image is a handwritten draft. And you can see on the right, there's another draft, and although it's typed, it's still not the final. There's been various annotations. One of the great things about that, when you have an archive like that, is you can see and you can capture the creative process. Most of us, if you go to the theatre, if you read a poem, you see a movie, you only see the end product. But when you have access to an archive like this, you can see the struggles the playwright may have had or the poet had to actually devise what they finally published and to get to where they wanted to go. As it also happens, a few years ago, the Abbey Theatre put on one of her plays, Katie Roach, and they used this archive a lot to inform decisions around the production of the play. That was brilliant for us. Obviously, we want our archives to be researched, but we also want them to be used in that way. It shows that our archives are still vital and still relevant. We go on to the next slide, please, Louise. So keeping with the literary, Deavy's archive is mainly letters and things of that nature, but this photo is Pierce Hutchinson collection. Archives aren't always just about letters. You can see here with albums, publications, and so on, some illustrations. We got this collection a few years ago after Hutchinson passed away, unfortunately. It's an absolutely mammoth collection, and it contains his letters, his work, his drafts, but also books, as I said, albums, posters, newspaper cuttings, including even several works of art. It's a wonderful treasure trove, and because it's so diverse, it's really useful as a repository of social history as well as of literary studies. Next slide, please, Louise. Here's an example, actually. This is a good example of the diversity. This is a letter from Eamon de Valera to Hutchinson's father. And Hutchinson's father and mother were heavily involved in the independence movement. You can see it there. De Valera has very clear views on the issue of coalition government, which is what we have at the moment. And he says, yeah, coalitions look well on the surface. They are fundamentally unsound. So De Valera, who was first president of Ireland, he wasn't first president at all. He was third, I think. He was not a man for spin. So again, this is the archive of a literary figure, but it's telling us something about history and government. Next slide, please. Just talk briefly about this. This is also literary, but it's in the Irish language, and it's from our Padre O'Leary archive. Now, Father Padre O'Leary was a Maynooth graduate. He's heavily involved in the Gaelic revival that I mentioned earlier. Our archive has works created by him from the late 19th century to the early 20th century. A really interesting thing about this archive, you can see it here, is that he writes everything in Irish in the Gaelic script. It's absolutely gorgeous to look at. It looks almost like a form of calligraphy. It is hard to read. Now, it may not be, I don't know how many Gaelgors there are among you, but it may not be obvious, but what's on show here is O'Leary's translation of Psalm 57. Next slide, please, Louise. So moving into history, we have a lot of archives which provide insight into Irish and European history. I mentioned the Marquess of Sligo papers, which provide a snapshot of the life of a young wealthy gentleman who's undertaking a grand tour and having a lark of a time, frankly. with papers relating to military families who fought in World War I, in Zulu Wars, in the Boer Wars of the late 19th century. A couple of images here from our Littlehouse archive. He was the Undersecretary for Military Affairs in the early 19th century in Dublin Castle. He worked with prime ministers and lord lieutenants and various big people of the day. He lived, you can see the top, it's one of the, his residence was in Phoenix Park and one of the official residences. That's what's shown. It's interesting for us in Maynooth that he had a connection to Maynooth because he married into the Fitzgerald family of Carton House, which is here in Maynooth. Next slide, please. That sets us up nicely for this absolutely gorgeous item. It's also of local interest. This is an indenture, and it's between George, the Earl of Kildare, and William Cheverley, Stewart. It's on vellum. It's dated 1st of March, 1633. Now, in it, the Earl grants land, and I quote, "in consideration of the true and faithful stewardship done by the said William Cheverley." And those lands he granted were in Maynooth. Needless to say, he doesn't give this for just anything. The indenture further tells us that Cheverley has to have, and I quote, "he shall have had in readiness one able footman, well armed and appointed, and with him shall answer and attend to the said Earl upon all services of the Crown and defence of the country within the county of Kildare." Now that's on vellum, and you can't really see it in the photo, unfortunately. It's a bit cropped, but just at the bottom, the original seal, which would have had the Earl's seal, is still attached to it, which is fantastic. Next slide, please. We'll stick with the local focus, and we move forward to the 20th century. This is the enrolment of local man Donal O'Buchala. David, I think you mentioned him, for the Irish Volunteer Force. Now, if you're familiar at all with Maynooth from your time living here as a student, you may remember O'Buchala shop on the main street. Long-standing Maynooth family, and I think David mentioned he was a revolutionary in 1916. He was also a TD, and he was the last Governor General of Ireland. The post was abolished in 1936. Next slide, please. I mentioned 1916. That segues nicely into this. This is our copy of the 1916 Proclamation. We were absolutely delighted to acquire this, and I think my colleagues in conservation will talk a little bit about it later as well. It's known worldwide as the foundational document of what would become the Republic of Ireland. It's very rare. It had initially, it was an ephemeral item anyway, so it had a print run of about 500 on poor quality paper. Most of those were destroyed during and immediately after the 1916 Rising. So there's very few known extant copies. Our current estimates, best guess, suggest 31, 32 maybe. It was printed in Liberty Hall in Dublin, 23rd of April 1916. And it's interesting because it had to be printed in two sections because there wasn't enough printing type. So that has a couple of things. Firstly, there's a divide, if you can see the last line of the paragraph, of its welfare and of its exaltation among the nations. That first half, everything above that was printed first. And then they had to print the second half afterwards. It also, they ran out of type, so you can see in the line at the top, Irish Republic. The C, the last C after in the end of Republic, is actually an O in terms of print, but they had to block off a bit of it to make a C. You can also see, if you look at the second last line of that paragraph I mentioned, "we pledge our lives and the lives of our comrades in arms," and even above that there are different shaped E's to the rest of it. And again, that's simply that they didn't have enough type to do what they needed. So I mean, from the point of view of research, it's a remarkable document. From the point of view of law and governance, it's a remarkable document. It's famous for being quite universalist compared to what actually happened in terms of the Republic. And we're just absolutely thrilled to have it. Now, it's interesting as well, and if we go to the next slide, please, Louise, our copy is quite notable. Firstly, it's signed by the poet, author, surgeon, politician, and public figure, Oliver St. John Gogarty. May be familiar for those of you that have read Ulysses as stately plump buck mulligan. Gogarty, we've never really established quite his role in the 1916 Rising, but he was an active participant in Sinn Féin, and he did assist people in the War of Independence. It was first owned by him, the 1916 Proclamation, this copy, and then it passed to Ernie O'Malley. Ernie O'Malley was a medical student like Gogarty, so he knew him. Ernie O'Malley, unlike Gogarty, got heavily involved in 1916 and subsequently with the volunteers in the War of Independence. And this proclamation remained with the family until it came to us. Now, a couple more slides. Next one, please, Louise. We've talked about the sort of scale of some of our literary archives. For archive size and everything, so our Kansai archive is quite small, 28 letters, 27 poems, a couple of articles, flyers, audio material, but in terms of the impact and power of the story, second to none. That archive charts the friendship of Irish nun Sister Magella McCarran and the activist Ken Saro-Wiwa. Sister Magella lived in Nigeria for over 30 years, and as part of a work, she worked with Ken Saro-Wiwa to highlight the issue of the environmental destruction of the Ogoni land by the international petrochemical industry. Saro-Wiwa was put in military detention, and while he was there, he wrote to Sister Magella, and his letters were smuggled out in bread baskets. They're exceptionally powerful. They're incredibly moving. Next slide, please. Another social cultural issue, we're very lucky to be the custodian of a unique collection of books, pamphlets, periodicals and ephemera relating to the Northern Ireland Troubles. Now, most of that archive dates from the 70s and 80s, and it really provides a vivid insight into the lives of all parts of a society in conflict. This is really important because the Troubles obviously saw fragmentation of society and people taking sides. Our archive has submissions from absolutely all parties involved. So it's very rounded out. It's about 600 items. It has political flyers, posters, newspapers, prayer leaflets, and a really interesting genre of Troubles romance novels, which is something I didn't know existed before we got it. And again, I'd stress it encompasses all shades of opinion. We're trying to add to this, so we're always on the lookout. And we hope that ultimately we'll have one, if not the best corpus of material relating to this challenging and turbulent part of Irish history. So, next. So, first and foremost, thanks for coming on this virtual journey with us. I said at the outset that we would only look at a drop of the ocean. I've noted here on the left a couple of areas that we didn't go into and we would have loved to. We do try to make our collections as accessible as possible, and we hope to make more of them accessible digitally over the next year or so. Last slide, please, Louise. It's been absolutely wonderful hosting you. I prattled on because there's just so much. And again, we will answer questions and a couple of links there. We'll have them up at the end as well. If you do have questions further after this, don't hesitate to get in contact with us. Thank you very much. And thanks to Louise for doing the slides.
Thank you, Hugh, for a fantastic presentation filled with fascinating and rich information. We do have a few questions that came up in the chat, and I'll go through them. We have 3. If anybody else would like to ask any questions in the chat, go ahead and post them as we go through these. So the first question was, how were the cuneiform tablets acquired by the library?
That's a really good question, and it's quite a challenging thing to answer. They were sent by a priest who was working in, I think it was Iraq at the time, the early part of the 20th century. And he brought them back, frankly. And he was an alumni of St. Patrick's, so he donated them. Now, this is a really hot topic at the moment because, I mean, we're thrilled to have them, obviously, but I suppose the most prominent example of that sort of thing is the Elgin marbles in the British Museum. There is always issues of colonialism when it comes to, you know, this sort of thing. So we're trying to do right by them, but we're very conscious that we only got them because somebody took them out of the territory at the time.
Our next question is, are there any Bibles in the collection in, and I am sorry, I don't know how to pronounce this, Koine, it's C-O-I-N-A-E, Greek?
Oh, Susan, you might know. I suspect there is. If you want to email me that one, we will look into that and get back to you.
Perfect. And the last question was, hi, you showed Shakespeare and Milton from the St. Canice's collection. Is most of the collection literary material, or what else did you find in it?
The Canice's is absolutely brilliant. It's there is literary material, but however, it's really, really diverse because again, it was composed of several previous collections, including bishops and so on. So there's philosophy in there, there's science, there's some great books on witchcraft, which actually I probably should have shown. So no, it's very diverse. I should also note as well, they're all catalogued by our colleague Yvette, and you will find them if you go to our website and do a search.
Another question came on, and let me see if I can find it. Sorry about that. What sort of material is contained in the Ocurri archive?
Now, that's a really good question. It's all in heavily accented Gaelic. Susan, do you have any?
No, but the manuscripts in general would have sermons, poetry, So, you know, a real mix of material, really like that, you know. So we do have the Clore, which is the index to the manuscripts. And so that's very extensive. And there's an index for first lines in the manuscripts, etc. So yeah, a bit of work to be done for anybody that wants to find out. But they're all listed. Also, we have them on microfilm, just to say that. So they can be accessed in the main library as well on microfilm.
And again, if you want more detail, email us and we'll come back to you with a bit more detail.
Absolutely, yeah.
Those are all the questions that came up in the chat. Hugh, I just noticed your video is off there.
Yeah, my video is off because my screen is still frozen, unfortunately.
Oh,
so I can't
okay.
do anything.
I see.
Sorry. It's
So
not
those are
modesty.
the questions. Were there any last questions that anyone wanted to ask in the chat?
There is one more here in the chat, David, that I'm seeing. There's what are some of the extinct languages represented in your Bible collection?
That's an excellent question, and myself and a colleague, we were talking about this earlier in the week when we had some seminarians in. It's hard to say precisely because it's so diverse. There are things like Aramaic and stuff, and there are a few things which I suppose it would probably be more accurate to say that they're not used anymore. I suppose you could get into a discussion about whether they qualify as extinct. Again, whoever sent that one, is it Tom? Tom, if you want to email me, we'll come back to you with more detail on that.
Yeah.
Okay, I think that that sums up the questions for the second talk.